talking about invasive species, an infestation of catastrophe. A singular topic with an abundance of problems. The idea that us as humans have the responsibility to protect the world that God created is not new. In fact, it was one of the first tasks that God assigned to us. And God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." Genesis 1:28. Having dominion over every living creature on the earth comes with making choices. Some choices are easy to make, while others are ugly and difficult. But it is our responsibility to do what is right. One of these upsetting choices appears before us now. Invasive species are on the rise and threaten to bring the downfall of native environments and species. Jackson Landers, the author of Eating Aliens, shares many of his experiences involving his hunting of invasive species. One of these experiences involves his hunting of invasive swine on Back Bay Island near Virginia. Jackson and his father-in-law faced many regulations about the way they could hunt, including shotguns only, no hunting outside your unmarked zone on pain of arrest, no scouting, no gutting or quartering your pigs, and finally, they must leave their hunting license at the front desk, leaving them with no license if they are stopped by wildlife and fisheries. There are roughly 300 hogs within the refuge borders, and only 15 had been harvested the previous year. In order for the pig population to remain steady, they should be eradicating at least 75% of the population each year. Jackson investigated these difficulties and came to this conclusion. Essentially, people couldn't come in to shoot the invasive species because that would present a danger to the people who were there to study the invasive species. And they couldn't stop the studies because then people wouldn't get the money to keep, well, studying. Not only were there an enormous amount of regulations on the hunters, but the researchers could not allow the hunters to help eliminate the problem or else they would lose their funding. Many stories like this across the United States help us to understand the complexity behind eradicating invasive species. But this does not only happen here. It happens all over the world. Invasive species threaten the entire world and must be stopped when they try to expand. Before the discussion of this topic can commence, there are terms that need to be defined. The term invasive, as used in this paper, refers to a plant, animal, or insect that is non-native to an environment and causes damage to that environment or its inhabitants. They can do this by outcompeting with local wildlife for natural resources, preying on native species, or providing some other risk to native life. The terms native and non-native also need to be defined. The term native refers to a plant or animal that is non-native to the term native refers to a species that plays a role in its environment and is not introduced into that ecosystem. A non-native species can play a role in an environment, but is introduced into that ecosystem. One final clarification is needed. When this paper uses the term exterminate, it does not mean to make extinct. Instead, it refers to various methods of removing a species from a particular environment. Throughout history, humans, as God has commanded, humans have the honor and the responsibility to protect this sect of his creation. The flourishing of flora and fauna can be seen through the movement and cultivation of different plants and animals, stock and crops. Countless landowners, farmers, researchers, and many affected civilians can testify that when these species become invasive, they can cause unbelievable damage to property and local environments. It is therefore imperative for the long-term protection of native plants and animals that invasive species be exterminated. Imagine a world where thousands of plants and animals are near extinction. There is little to no variation in flora and fauna across the earth, and there is a low biodiversity due to a large majority of native plants and animals becoming extinct. Invasive species dominate almost all ecosystems and continue to ravage and threaten the lives of people. This could be our future if invasive species continue to spread and people continue to do nothing about it. Despite the general population's neglect to take action, there is one person who has decided to take on Louisiana's strongest invaders. Officer Chris Slopak works part-time trapping Louisiana's worst invader, the wild hog. Officer Slopak grew up trapping wild hogs and has recently begun using cellular traps to capture entire sounders of swine. However, even this is not enough. As there are roughly 6 million wild hogs in the US, and their population only continues to increase. People like Officer Slopak and thousands of farmers across multiple states are blighted by the presence of this invasive species, which continues to spread like a wildfire, showing no signs of stopping soon. Many of our commercial, agricultural, and recreational activities depend on healthy native ecosystems. The U.S. Department of Agriculture ranked Louisiana the 9th most invaded state in December of 2021. One might question how this came to be the case. The answer is humans. We have introduced countless species, such as wild hogs, Burmese pythons, Asian mosquitoes, apple snails, and Asian carp, to places that they do not belong, and sometimes by accident. The Mississippi River is home to roughly 900 different species and provides an excellent pathway for aquatic invaders to cross the U.S. An example of this is when seeds and other organisms hitchhike on trading vessels. But Louisiana is not the only place that is suffering. Many countries around the world suffer from these non-native pests, like Asian carp in both America and Europe, or apple snails, or cane toads in virtually every country with a warm climate. If we continue to let these chaotic creatures and ravenously destructive plants reign, then I see a bleak future for not only the United States, but for the entire world. We can avoid all of this distress if we eliminate all invasive species. It is obvious that if we do not act now, then the enormously fast rate of reproduction of these species will spiral out of control and irreversible damage will be done. One example of the extremely fast rate of reproduction is the wild hog. The wild hog reproduces 1 to 2 times per year with a short gestation period of 114 days, producing at least 4 to 6 piglets per litter. This is only one example of an invasive species' ability to expand exponentially. If we continue to do nothing about it, what is to stop them from wiping out entire ecosystems? One of the defining characteristics of an invasive species is its ability to quickly reproduce and outcompete with local wildlife. Many invasive species don't have any predators other than humans. Some don't have any at all. The National Park Service says that South Louisiana is an easy place for many plants to thrive. Humidity and a long growing season mean that many plants grow bigger and faster than they would elsewhere, and many non-native species quickly become invasive species. Humans have caused many species to become endangered or extinct. Why should we not expect that we can do this with invasive species? An example of this is wild hogs, which are a Tier 1 invader in Louisiana. This means that they are currently having severe or widespread negative impacts on wildlife or natural communities in Louisiana. This includes species that have a limited distribution in the state, but that have severe impacts where found. Wild hogs dig up plants and kill smaller animals while continuing to boom in population. The only predators for wild hogs in Louisiana are black bears, which are omnivores, and panthers. Both of these animals are rare in our state. Another example is giant salvinia, which is also a Tier 1 invader in Louisiana. Giant salvinia is infesting our lakes and creating enormous monocultures that restrict other plants from growing. This means that we all need to stand up now if we want to protect our environments. Humans have caused many species to become endangered or extinct. Why should we not expect that we can do this with invasive species? Faced with these facts, we could and should eliminate invasive species at all costs. Recklessly, we have driven many formerly plentiful species to extinction or to extirpation from a section of their range. The difference is motivation, not capability. Humans have the capability to be very destructive. In the past, we have carelessly driven many species to near extinction. We can use this ability of ours to wipe out these pests for the greater good. Humans are the most effective when they are motivated by something. And you might ask, what can we get from these invaders? The answer is food. Hunger is a huge problem around the world, with roughly 20% of our population suffering from extreme food shortages. And we have massive populations of delectable food just walking around. Many people might not be fully convinced to try eating new types of food, and Jackson Landers offers an example of this. During colonial times, lobsters were considered edible by only the most desperate segments of the population. Household servants would include provisions in their contracts stating that they could not be fed lobster more than 4 times a week. Today, lobster sells for around $10 a pound at the grocery store, more than most cuts of beef. What transformed lobster from a peasant food into a delicacy was simply a change in perspective. Not only can we use them for food, but it also protects our agriculture and local environments. Hunting, trapping, chemicals, and covering are some of the methods that we can use to get rid of invasive species. For animals that would be used for food, hunting and trapping would be required. For less edible ones, insecticides and herbicides can be used. Covering is a tactic where monocultures are covered with a large tarp that blocks out sunlight and stops the spread and growth of invasive plants. According to the World Conservation Union, invasive species are the second most significant threat to biodiversity after habitat loss. In these new environments, invasive alien species become predators, competitors, parasites, hybridizers, and diseases of our native and domesticated plants and animals. God has given us dominion over all of the animals on this earth, and it is our duty to protect them. But it is also our responsibility to ensure that the earth is healthy and in balance. Since we are to follow God's commands, we must preserve His great natural creation. These invasive species already have a place where they are native somewhere else, but they threaten our native species here locally. The United States has over 50,000 exotic invasive species that cause major environmental damage. They also reduce the ability to export goods and reduce property values of affected areas. Back in 2013, Lisa DeBruckere, a well-certified member of the National Wildlife Society, went further to state that the estimated damage from invasive species worldwide totals more than $1.4 trillion, or 5% of the global economy. It has been over a decade since this article has been published, and the situation is only getting worse. The United States spends an absurd amount of money on the maintenance and control of currently populated areas, or on legal fees from exported and imported goods from invaded areas. This maintenance consists of setting up barricades and bounties for invasive animals and using insecticides and herbicides for invasive plants and insects. They also pay some landowners to remove some invasive species from their properties. They also endanger human lives along with these expensive costs. Invasive plants can clog water delivery systems, damage essential infrastructure, and increase risk of wildfires. Monocultures of invasive plants can cover large areas and become fuel for wildfires, while vines and ivies can climb trees and become a conduit for fire to reach the canopy. Invasive animals can directly attack both people and their properties, and invasive insects can carry various diseases and weaken the structural integrity of buildings. With all of these dangers to both our health and economy, it is the ethical choice to make to end these continuous threats. All of this evidence and research indicates that if we do not do something now, then our economy, environments, and maybe even lives will be put in danger. To continue the protection of God's glorious future and of God's glorious creation, we must eliminate all invasive species. Thousands of competent scientists and zealous lovers of animals have formulated the idea that humans should not intervene with the spread of invasive species into new habitats because it is not their fault that they have arrived where they are. Vox Media, a left-leaning news source, uses climate change for its reasoning, stating that climate change and the rain shifts it's causing are extraordinary circumstances. If a species is fleeing from a habitat that it's burning or melting, is it ever fair to call it invasive? The destruction of animal habitats can result in the migration of many animal species. However, climate change does not play a big destructive and rapidly spreading qualities that make them such a threat. Yet the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, or PETA, and many researchers associated with Vox Media, the New York Times, and the National Post all agree that invasive species should be left alone. When discussing climate change, one must first define what is meant by climate change, as there are two modern interpretations. NASA defines climate change as a long-term change in the average weather patterns that have come to define Earth's local, regional, and global climates. This is the use of the term climate change in this argument. The other use of the term climate change has been confused in the media and is more accurately titled global warming. Global warming is the warming of the entire Earth with many other detrimental properties. This changing in the climate will not be addressed in this argument. Continuing forward, climate change can create opportunities for invasive species to enter into environments by lowering biodiversity. This lowering in biodiversity weakens the environment and makes it more susceptible to climate change, thus creating a downward spiral. Is it not our task from God to protect our environments and ensure that they do not become unrecognizable? We must target these invasive species to protect our environments and regain our lost biodiversity. It is important to note that climates are constantly changing and tend to fluctuate year to year or even decade to decade. These changes are typically slight enough not to empower the spread of an invasive species into a new habitat. But if one were to become invasive, it would weaken the environment and lower its biodiversity, allowing more species to wreak havoc. Many people who argue against the extermination of invasive species do so by taking a moral high ground. Vox Media speaks on the problems with calling them invasive by stating, the very notion of invasion draws on a war metaphor. And media narratives about non-native species are remarkably similar to those describing enemy armies or immigrants. It is true that some of the language used is warlike. However, this is exactly why it is used. It is a war. It is a constant battle and struggle to protect our world. If we stop and let our species become endangered or extinct, then we have lost. Along with this comparison to warlike language, Vox Media then begins to rant that it is xenophobia in its relation to human racism by stating, to protect the genetic integrity of species, conservationists often go to extraordinary lengths to prevent animals from hybridizing, which bears uncomfortable parallels to Western preoccupations with racial purity that have only recently went out of fashion. They then try to combine both of these together with yet another relation to both warlike language and xenophobia. In a recent article from The Guardian about armadillos besieging North Carolina, it describes them as pests and freakish. It also gawks at their booming reproduction rate, an allegation that, not coincidentally, is leveled against human migrants. The argument about genetic integrity is a strange connection to make. It is important to enforce the separation between these two species, but for a different reason other than racism. The reasoning is that once an invasive species breeds with a native species, it produces a hybrid that has even more destructive potential than before. The hybrid offspring will possess the adaptation to the environment from the native parent and the destructive qualities from the invasive parent. By trying to compare terms used to describe hateful relations between people to terms being used as statistically accurate ways of describing plants and animals, media sources are trying to guilt people into siding with their side of the argument. But invasive species are not people, and terms used to describe them should not be related to racist and discriminatory terminology used by people against people. The destruction of environments due to climate change has little to no effect on the number of invasive species. The warlike language used to describe these species is effective because it is a war to protect our native species from extinction. Countless media sources misuse terms and try to compare the treatment of invasive species to xenophobic actions between people. But invasive species are not people and should not be compared to our conflicts. All of these reasons prove the inadequacy of these arguments. Now is the time to stand up against invasive species. Using hunting, trapping, chemicals, and covering, like insecticides and herbicides, we can push back against invasive species. If we do not act now, then our native species and environments will become endangered or extinct. Our economy will continue to be ravaged by maintenance costs, and maybe even our lives will be put in danger. Hear this reason and stand up against invasive species. The future of God's glorious creation depends on it. Thank you. I would now like to open up the floor for questions. Dr. Alchami?
Zach did excellent work here. You made a really strong case for, first of all, the feasibility of fighting back against these invasive species, and furthermore, the threat to the biodiversity, possibly leading to a threat to survival of the very species. Human side of that, is there any work being done? Is there perhaps still developing a science of biodiversity, where scientists are trying to gauge what's the most or the best balance of biodiversity that we can attain? Because that could also be potentially,
Dangerous.
well, I was going to say inspiration to act now and to fight against the more dangerous kinds of biodiversity.
So for my fans on YouTube who didn't hear the question, I will repeat it. So Dr. Alachami asked, is there a kind of like a median that can be reached with the amount of biodiversity? And I would just like to say that I feel like a good example of biodiversity for any environment would be one where every animal or every species for that matter plays a role. If a species is not playing a role in its environment and it's just like existing there, or it doesn't have any predators, it doesn't feed into the environment or benefit it in any way, then that species does not need to be there. Of course, most environments that you see that are full of native species are like this. They have, every species does something for the environment, no matter how small it is. With invasive species, when they come into an environment, they sometimes don't have any predators, and they will just completely ravage all the other species. So it is important to just have species that, well, I wouldn't say work together because, they're eating each other, but, they coexist in a meaningful way. Does that answer your question?
That was a very good answer.
Isaiah.
I have a question. What would you say to those who say that nature will work itself out, where it's throughout history that that's just how nature is, where another species kills another species, and then, or you said as invasive species breeding with native species, where it creates new species, and that's just how it works. What would you say to people who say that?
So the question was, what would I say to people who say that the nature will just work its way out, like work itself out, and that we shouldn't intervene? So, what I'll say is that if you look at at the wild hog population here in the United States, wild hogs are a hybrid of razorbacks and Spanish swine that came over in the 1500s, I'm pretty sure. Don't quote me on that. But their population is entirely invasive to this continent. And the spreading that they have, the destruction and spread that they have caused, like I said, there's over 6 million of them in the United States, and they just continue to spread. I said in my paper that they have at least 4 to 6 piglets per litter, but they can get up to 15 per litter, and they breed 1 to 2 times per year. The piglets, 6 months after they're born, they can breed. And they can each have their own litters of about 15 piglets. So the number of these pigs is not increasing. Nature is not sorting itself out. Mr. Kendrick?
So you speak with such passion. I compliment you on that. I am encouraged to do something. I have 2 questions. The first is, so I've lived in Northwest Louisiana pushing 20 years, and I've never seen a wild hog, and I've never thought of one before. And so I need to get out more. But in addition to that, like, what would you say to someone like me who says, like, I've gotten along well and my life has been unaffected? What would you say to that?
So unless you hunt or you drive around a lot on old roads in the country where like there's forest on either sides, it would make sense for you to not see wild hogs, as they are wild animals and don't like going in the cities. But I am going to say, just because you don't see something doesn't mean that it's not there. I mean, there's starving children in Africa. You can't see them right now, but they're still there. And so for people who don't get affected every day by invasive species, I would recommend that you do your research into ones that are in your area. And I know not all people are going to want to go out and start shooting invasive species or trapping them immediately. There are other ways that you can contribute. You can donate to causes that do that. I know that you can get into contact with people that you know that do trap and eliminate hogs or whatever invasive species it is. You can report them if you see them, like invasive plants. If you see an invasive plant, tell the landowner because most of the time they want to get those removed. If you see an invasive species on a property, you can tell the landowners or call your local, wildlife and fisheries, and they'll just notify them that it's there and they'll deal with it. Other than that, I mean, donating to studies about invasive species can help. So there's many ways that people who don't often see invasive species can contribute to that.
No further questions, Mr.
Oh, I really had one though. I really did.
Let's go with
Okay.
Mitchell. Yeah, or who wants to go?
So,
Yeah.
what's the impact in the city limits of the invasive species of pigs, particularly to a school?
So the question was, what are the impacts of invasive species within city limits, like especially like a school? So for our school in particular, we do have some woods around here and there are some animals, but invasive species can, as I stated in my paper, they can damage infrastructure. They can, like if it's an invasive insect, they can weaken the structural integrity of buildings. They can increase risk of wildfires and water cloggings. They can also just directly attack people. Like wild hogs are very aggressive and they have tusks that will slice you up. So I don't know if that answers your question. Okay.
There's many types. Thank
Mr.
you.
Davis?
Do you think feral hogs will replace lobster as a delicacy?
So honestly, they already are a delicacy. Me and my family, or my family and I, to use proper grammar, we eat them like almost on the regular. Although I wouldn't recommend eating the boars because they don't taste good. The testosterone in their body like completely messes them up. But they do taste really good.
I appreciate that. So, just to affirm, we had a field out in the back. It was looking amazing. I'd come back one weekend. I'm like, what kids have been running up the field? And then Officer Slopak said, that's not field, it's feral hogs.
Mm-hmm.
And he ended up killing 20 back in our back, which is pretty crazy. I guess one of the questions I have is, in my yard, in my neighborhood, I have alligators, snakes, and armadillos. I'm pretty sure the first two are native.
Well, depends on the snake, but yes.
Yeah. And so how do you determine what's invasive and what isn't?
So
like getting rid of things, because I want to get rid of all three.
So the question was, how do we determine what species are invasive? I would encourage you to go online, and Google has image searches that you can do nowadays. Go online, do research into your area, see what species are invasive in your area, because I have an entire paper from 2015. It's a little outdated, but it lists the tier, scientific name, and normal name of every single invasive species in Louisiana. So you can find them online. I just encourage you to do research. If you see an animal and you're like, I haven't seen that before. Although just because you haven't seen it before doesn't mean it's invasive. It could just be non-native. There is this, in a paragraph that I did not speak on in my essay, I mentioned something called the 10% rule. The 10% rule mentions that 10% of all species introduced into an environment will become non-native or even gain a foothold. and 10% of those will become invasive. So 1% of the original. So the number of species that will even become invasive in environment is very low, but it is still happening. And those species, there doesn't even have to be a lot of them, as seen in the wild hogs. It's just, they can just expand. Mitchell?
So you said humans are a lot of the cause for these invasive species. What are your thoughts on like agricultural crops that aren't native to the land being brought over and grown? It's more of a controlled environment, but there's still a problem there?
So like I mentioned, if a species is not actively destructive to an environment and doesn't actively spread and outcompete with local environments, with local species, then it's not invasive. It's just non-native. Non-native species aren't necessarily bad. They can fill a role into an environment. Like if a species goes extinct, I know, what was it, in one of the national parks, they killed out all the wolves. And it was downward spiral. Everything went really bad. So they had to introduce this new species of wolves. The wolves filled the slot of the old ones. They're not native, but they are not invasive because they have a role in the environment. So people bringing over these crops to grow, I mean, think about it. Chickens aren't native really to North America, but we still have them here to eat them. If they're not just roaming around causing damage to environments, then they're not invasive, and therefore there's nothing wrong with them. Grace?
So I live on base, and a couple times a year they will close down the part of the base that's like just the woods, and they will hunt and try to eliminate as many of those wild hogs as they can. So would you suggest something like that as a way to kind of exterminate the wild hogs?
So the question was, would I recommend that we like close down areas within like a specific time of the year to hunt and exterminate wild hogs within them? I would say that we need to do more than that. Of course, putting bounties on invasive animals does come with a risk, because there was an example where there were cobras, right? No one likes snakes, but they put a bounty on them to get rid of them, and people started breeding cobras in their backyards to kill them and sell them for money. And then they were like, okay, this is not having the desired effect that we wanted. So they got rid of the bounty, and those people just released the cobras. So in fact, it actually created more snakes than originally desired. But I do think some sort of bounty is needed. I'm not exactly sure how to place that. Like maybe a bounty only during certain times of the year, like during deer season, or maybe an off season of deer season. That way people who like hunting all year round will have some incentive to do so. Right now, I know specifically wild hogs, there is no regulations about when you can hunt them, or, well, I mean, if it's not on your property, you can't hunt them there, but if there's no regulations about when you can hunt them. You can hunt them at night, you can hunt them in the day, you can hunt them all year round. And currently there's no bounty on them, but I really feel like we should put something there to encourage people. Does that answer your question? Let's go with Paige. Okay, so I want to be a vet, and I wanted to do something with animals. And I was sitting here thinking, what could I do with animals? And I was talking with my dad, and my family hunts. So we've encountered wild hogs before, which is kind of why I specified the majority of my paper around wild hogs. And we see the destruction that they've caused. So I wanted to do a paper on wild hogs. Ms. Schmidt said that's not broad enough. So I broadened it to invasive species, and I'm glad that I did, because the amount of information out there that would not have been covered if it was just wild hogs is a lot. So I broadened it for invasive species, and it has taught me a lot.
I'm
So there would be no invasive species that is native to that environment that it is in, because it would already have predators and a specified role in that environment. Although I will say all invasive species are native to somewhere. They are from somewhere and they belong in that place. They fill this niche in some environment, just not here.
Okay, Zachary, you are number 20 of all of these senior pieces.
I would like to thank my class for giving me the honor of being last.
Can we give a round of applause to Ms. Barish and all our advisors? And then, of course, I want to say we need to give all of our seniors a round of applause. So obviously, my year has been full of all kinds of topics. I have learned all kinds of things. I'm sure that you can tell it's been a roller coaster some days. We go from social media to invasive species to illness to gun control. And so I feel like this a lot of times. But I am very proud of them, and I do hope that they all know that. Let's pray and we'll be dismissed. Dear Heavenly Father, when we see our students do things like this, we are overwhelmed by what you give us here at Providence. We are so thankful, and we ask, as in all days and all things, that we are always focused on you and all of the gifts that you give us. May we always honor you. In Jesus' name we pray.
Amen.
You guys know you don't have to come to school.
You knew your stuff, boy.